Welcome back to another episode of Working Man's Guide to Documenting Web API Reference using OpenAPI 3.0 and VS Code. In this episode, we will talk about URL components of REST API. The URL of REST-based API has three significant parts. A base URL, which comprises of scheme and host. Scheme is basically the protocol. Since we're interested in REST APIs, this could be either HTTP or HTTPS. And then we have host. This is the path to the API server. This is also known as the core part of the base URL. Secondly, we have endpoints. These are specific point of entry to an API, and they are attached to a resource. This resource could be either a single object or a collection of similar objects. And all of these objects are accessible over HTTP or HTTPS by using standard HTTP request methods like GET, POST, PUT, PATCH, or DELETE. Lastly, we have query strings. These are nothing but set of parameters attached to the API URL. They are used to narrow down the response received from the API server. A way to identify the query string is they always have a question mark in front of them. If you take the URL shown on the screen as an example, the section indicated as base URL is used to access the correct server. If you type in just this section in your browser's address bar, you will probably get nothing or an error. The section indicated as endpoint represents the path to the data about the pet, and more specifically about the pet with the specified pet ID. Pet ID here is also known as the path parameter. A path parameter, including the curly braces, should be replaced by the actual value of the parameter when invoking the API. After base URL and endpoint comes query string. In the example, the query string represents filter criteria. When you execute the example URL, you can access the data about pets, whose status property has the value available. Notice the question mark between endpoint and the query string. There should always be a single question mark between endpoint and the query string. That way, the API server would be able to tell apart a query string from an endpoint. While we are at the topic of path parameters, I want to take a moment to talk about the syntax of path parameters. There are currently two ways to identify a path parameter. A path parameter is either surrounded by curly braces or has a colon in front of it. So what do you go with? If the documentation generator of your choice supports both of these syntaxes, you could go with either of them. But since this video series is all about OpenAPI 3.0 specification, you should note that OpenAPI specification for path parameters are loosely modeled on RFC 6570, which uses curly braces as delimiters as opposed to colons. Also, remember, you need to replace the path parameter, including the delimiter, with the value of path parameter to make an API call. We'll conclude this episode here. In the next episode, we'll talk about the common HTTP request methods. Till then, stay safe.